Get your gun.
That I taught, I think World War I is the most important. World War I is the great divide in the history of the United States and the history of Europe. It marks a chasm between the 19th and the 20th century. If you could get into a time machine and go back to 1910, you would be in a world that would be slightly familiar to you, but definitely antique. If you could get into that same time machine and go back to 1920, after World War I, you would be in the modern world that you would recognize today. The phones might be a little different, the cars might be a little different, but I think you would feel very comfortable in that world. Now, when I used to teach World War II, I would ask if there are any World War II veterans in the class. Every once in a while, a hand would go up. I don't think I'm going to ask today if there are any World War I veterans in the class. But tell me, how many of you knew a World War I veteran? There must be somebody here. How many people knew a World War I veteran? Okay, yes. Who did you know? Is that your father?
No, but a couple of his brothers.
A couple of his brothers?
Yeah, my father was slightly too young. Had a couple of his brothers, and I think on my mother's side, there may have been one or two also.
Okay, so
and certainly my mother's oldest sister, husband, was an ambulance driver in France in World War I.
Wow. You should have been in Italy. You could have known Ernest Hemingway. All right, anyone else? Who else had a World War I veteran in their family or knew a World War I veteran? Yes, in the back.
One of my uncles was a World War I veteran.
He was in the Army, I assume?
In the Army, yeah.
In France?
In France.
Okay, I assume he came home okay.
He did. I'm not sure, but I think he was a Teamster.
A Teamster?
Horses.
Okay.
Horses.
All right, anyone else? Yes.
My two grandfathers were in World War I, and my mother's father died when she was only 3 as a result of the gassings. But my other grandfather survived and survived a stroke in the 1950s, so I knew him quite well.
So you knew him quite well. So it's interesting, World War I is now 100 years in the past, but there's still people living today in here who knew World War I veterans, who have a personal connection with World War I. During World War I, my 3 uncles were drafted into the American Army, but I don't think my grandmother fed them very much because they were all rejected from the American Army. They weighed about between 95 and 110 pounds. And I think the Army sent them home and told them to eat some more. Told my grandmother to feed them better, so they went home and they started to eat more, but by the time they got, I guess, sufficient weight to be drafted into the Army, the war was over because it lasted only 18 months. I actually had only one relative who served in the First World War. That was my great uncle Armin, and I used to see him when I was a kid. He had a store at 2nd and Market Street, and that's where my father had a store. And I would talk to him, and he would talk about his World War I service. And it was after a while I realized that he had served in the Austrian Army during the First World War. He was a lieutenant, and I remember him showing me his Austrian Army identification card. And I would ask him, I said, why are you carrying around your Austrian Army identification card? And he said, well, they told me when I was in the Army I had to keep it with me at all times. And this would have been about 1966. So I remembered that. So if you're interested, afterwards I can show you my 1962 U.S. Army draft card, which I have with me because it says I must keep it with me at all times. I like to tell that to my wife, and it drives her nuts. What are you carrying around that old thing for? You're never going to be. They're never going to call you. Well, you never know. You know, they might stop me and they might ask me, but I always have my U.S. Army draft card from 1962. One of the funny things about my uncle, no, I don't think I need it. The funny things about my Uncle Armin was when he went down to apply for Social Security, one of the questions asked him was, are you a World War I veteran? And he proudly pulled out his Austrian Army identification card and he said, yes. And he showed it to them and they looked at it and they said, sorry, wrong Army. So he didn't get the extra benefits from Social Security for being a World War I veteran. All right, but World War I is a critically important war, and it is a war that is not taught today. It's a war that's largely forgotten. I would bet that if we could go outside and stop 25 students walking around outside and ask them a question about World War I. When was it fought? Who did we fight? What happened in the war? Nobody would know anything. It's been almost completely forgotten. It used to be known as the Great War. It didn't become known as World War I until about 1942, after the start of the Second World War. But World War I and World War II really marked the two bookends of the single war, modern 30 years conflict from 1914 to 1945. And the interesting fact about World War I was that it really didn't need to be fought. Europe in 1914 was prosperous. England, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and even Russia. These were prosperous countries. England, France, and Germany had colonies all over the world. Germany's greatest trading partner was England. The French had sold a large number of goods and services to Germany. During that time, before 1914, you could travel between all those countries. You could be a musician in London and playing. And if you wanted to travel to Moscow, you could cross the Channel, cross France, take the railroad across Germany, across Austria and Russia, and you didn't even need a passport. They didn't have a passport. All you needed was a business card. So it was practically freedom of travel, total freedom of travel, very few tariffs between these countries. There was a book written in 1912 or 13 saying how war would be impossible between the great powers, even though there was armament building up and tension building up. But they said war would be impossible between the great powers because of the trade and the fact that they were so interconnected together. But there were dangers on the horizon. There were stresses within each country. You go in Germany, for example. Germany had a large socialist, almost quote communist party who were followers of Karl Marx. And on any one day, you could go out and there would be 1 million people in the streets of Berlin cheering the Socialist Party platform. And the next day you would go out and there would be 1 million people cheering the Kaiser and his army. So there were tensions in these societies. They were highly industrialized. More wealth was being created, but the wealth tended to be concentrated more at the top than at the bottom. And there was a feeling in 1914 that a war was coming and there was nothing that could be done. The danger area was in the Balkans. Now, where have we heard that before? In the Balkans, between Serbia and Austria. Serbia had only come into existence in 1878, and Serbia wanted to expand, especially wanted to expand into the area south of Serbia, known as Bosnia-Herzegovina. And unfortunately, Austria also had claims on Bosnia-Herzegovina, and sometime around 1900, Austria annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, thus making Serbia a deadly enemy. So the Serbs, were not nice people. They assassinated their own king in 1904. They started shooting Austrians, and tensions increased between Serbia and Austria. And Serbia had a protector. The protector was the Tsar of all the Russias. And the Kaiser, who had lost his alliance with Russia, encouraged the Russians in that regard to support the Serbs. So there were dangers on the horizon. But there was no reason for the First World War to be fought. It was thought to be the unnecessary war. The war breaks out in July 1914 when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand makes a ceremonial visit to Sarajevo on July 28th. He was warned by the Serbian ambassador not to go to Sarajevo on July 28th because that's the day of the famous defeat by the of the Turks and the Serbian army in 1428, and tensions were running high. But he wanted to get out of Vienna, and he wanted to go on this ceremonial visit to Sarajevo. He wanted to bring his wife with him. So he took the train down there. In fact, he and his wife went into Sarajevo on the 27th of June, and they walked around the flea market, and they thoroughly enjoyed themselves. And they got up the next morning, and they got in the car, and they drove into Sarajevo. Now, they didn't know, but waiting for them were 6 assassins that were funded by the Black Hand, which was a sort of secret organization. Some say set up by the Serbian army, although that's not been definitely proved. There's probably a Serbian army organization. So they set themselves up on the various street corners waiting for the Archduke, and the Archduke was coming into the town on a large touring car. It was open, and to make sure everybody knew who he was, he had on a bright blue uniform, and he had a hat with green feathers, shooting out the top. It was almost as if he had a bullseye on him, saying, "Shoot here." So they drove into Sarajevo, and while they're driving into Sarajevo, one of the assassins pulls out a bomb, a hand grenade, and throws it at the Archduke's car. It bounces off the steering wheel, lands on the street, and explodes behind the car. Well, the Archduke wasn't hurt, and he went on to City Hall. The people behind him in the car was hurt. So he gets to City Hall, he gets out of the car, and he's going up the stairs, and the Lord Mayor greets them. "Oh, Mr. Archduke, we're very glad to have you today. Welcome to Sarajevo." And the Archduke is a little agitated. He said, "What do you mean?" He says, "They just tried to kill me. What's happening down here?" So the Archduke calls it off. He says, "I'm not going into the City Hall." He says, "I'm getting out of town," which was probably a good idea. And he should have gotten out of town the short way, headed right back to the train station, right back to Vienna. But before he gets out of town, he says, "I'll go to the hospital and visit the people who were hit in the bomb blast." So they hop back into the open car. They start driving back the way they came. Well, nobody told the driver that they were going back that same way. So, while one of the assassins had thrown his bomb, the other 5 hadn't had a chance. One had, chickened out. The Archduke went by, but he was afraid to pull his gun, and the others weren't in range. So the Archduke drives back, and they go down this side street, and the Archduke taps the driver on the shoulder and says, "Hey, idiot, you're going the wrong way. We're going to the hospital. We got to turn around." So they stop the car, and he's trying to put the gear in to turn it around. They stopped in front of a sandwich shop. And who's in the sandwich shop? The guy by the name of Gavrilo Princeps, one of the assassins, who's very depressed because he's been waiting there all morning for the Archduke to go by, and the Archduke hasn't gone by. So he comes out on the street, and he sees this big touring car with this man in a blue uniform and a fancy hat, and his wife in a white gown, and the horses around him. He doesn't know who they are. And he taps the policeman. He says, "Hey," he says, "who's over there?" The policeman says, "Oh, that's the Archduke Franz Ferdinand." So Princeps says, "Oh, well, thank you very much." And he pulls out his revolver, bam, 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 bam. Kills the Archduke, and he kills his wife. He was actually sorry that he killed his wife. Didn't mean to kill his wife. The Archduke is hit once, his wife is hit once, and he dies. They took him to the hospital, but they couldn't do anything for him. Well, this is the event that kicks off the beginning of the First World War, although nothing happened immediately. The Archduke's body was taken back to Vienna, where the people of Vienna were not exactly unhappy with the death of the Archduke. I think the feeling in Vienna was that if anyone in the royal family had to be shot, the Archduke was their first candidate, because he had been interested in reform, and he wanted to expand the empire and bring the Slavs in and give them an equal say in government, and that wasn't very popular. So they wait 3 weeks, and Conrad von Holzendorf, who's the chief of staff of the Austrian army, has been trying to find an excuse to go to war against Serbia. So he finally convinces the Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, to sign the declaration of war. But before the emperor signs a declaration of war, he has an alliance with Germany, and he wants to make sure that the Germans will support him. So he sends 2 telegrams to Germany. He sends one to the Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the Kaiser turns it over to his foreign secretary, Bettman Hollweg, and he sends one to Moltke the Younger, who's head of the German army. And they're waiting a couple days. He gets 2 replies back. Moltke the Younger says, "Go ahead, mobilize the army, beat up the Serbians." And Bettman Hollweg says, "Oh, wait a minute, hold it, it's dangerous. You know, the Serbians are supported by the Russians. If the Russians come into the war, then we have to mobilize. We'll get into war with France. This could be a general war." So, the Austrians are wondering, who's ruling in Berlin? The problem was there were two sources of authority in Berlin. But the Austrians decided to mobilize the army, and they don't want the war that they got. They don't want a large-scale war. They want a small conflict that's going to be very nasty to Austria. But the war they got is going to last 4 years, and it's going to result in the death of 9 million men, maybe 2 or 3 million more civilians. It's going to result in the destruction of 4 great empires: the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian, not the Ottoman Empire. It's going to be a horrendous war. That's the problem with going to war. You go to war for one reason, and sometimes things slip out of your control. And wars are very easy to start, they're not easy to stop. All right, now how does this involve the United States? Well, it involves the United States because the United States in 1914 is a great power. We had fought the Spanish-American War. They were very tough opponents. Not really. But we have fought the Spanish-American War. We have an empire in the Philippines. We have possessions in the Pacific. The United States had a population of about 90 million. It had an industrial plant which was the equal of any of the European powers. So we had great military potential. We didn't have a great military. The military in 1914, the United States Army was about 96,000 men and was mainly stationed on the frontier, a legacy of fighting the Indian Wars. So the United States now becomes involved. Woodrow Wilson's involved. Now, why is this war important to the United States? It's important because it fundamentally changes the relationship of the American people to the American government. When the American government was formed in 1787, when you hear about the writing of the Constitution and what the founding fathers made, they wrote a very spare document describing the powers of the federal government. The powers of the federal government were to maintain domestic peace and tranquility, was to maintain an army, was to maintain a navy. We had a postmaster general, we had an attorney general, and the government had very limited powers. Most Americans had very little to do with the government. The government's taxing authority was defined by the tariffs, and that's how they got the money from the tariff. There was no income tax. There were no intrusive documents to be filled out. You could immigrate to the United States. There were no immigration papers. You just landed. Those functions were handled by the state. In the 1830s, Henry Clay wanted to build a system of roads in the United States financed by the federal government. There was a great debate. Was this a proper thing for the federal government to do? Clay eventually got his national system of roads through. But the federal government had a very limited role in the domestic affairs of most Americans. Now this changes in the 1850s with the onset of the years before the Civil War, when the federal government was responsible for the territories. The question was, would the territories be slave or would they be free? And they began a contest of wills between the North and South over slave states and free states. Eventually this is going to result in the firing on Fort Sumter, 4 years of Civil War, and the ending of slavery in the United States. After the ending of slavery in the United States, the Constitution is amended. We passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which essentially gets the federal government involved and the protection of the civil liberties of Americans. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th Amendment defined citizenship, made black men citizenship. The 15th Amendment guaranteed civil rights to the newly freed slaves. Now, after the Civil War, America changes greatly. We have the Industrial Revolution come to America. You know, the great captains of industry, Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J. Pierpont Morgan, creating the steel industry, creating the oil industry, creating the finance industry. And these guys are making millions and millions of dollars. They're not paying their workers very much. You have industrial strife in the United States, but a lot of wealth is being generated. Incidentally, anyone know what Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J. Pierpont Morgan had in common during this period of time? They're all young men in the 1860s. What do they have in common? None of them served in the Civil War. They all paid substitutes. They were, I mean, John D. Rockefeller, he was busy, establishing an oil industry in Pennsylvania and Ohio. He didn't have time to serve in the Civil War. The same with Andrew Carnegie. So these men amass immense wealth. With the immense wealth comes a rise of labor unions, and it comes the rise of strikes, and these industries mainly were opposed to unions, did everything they could to break the unions. They hired private detective agencies such as the Pinkertons. When that didn't work, they got the state governor to call in federal troops to put down the workers. There were very bitter coal strikes in West Virginia, very bitter steel strikes in Homestead, Pennsylvania. So the federal government is becoming more involved in the affairs of its citizens through the suppression of strikes and through the passage of laws such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, which tried to break up some of these large corporations. Wasn't too successful, but it tried to break up these large corporations. All right, so the federal government, in other words, has a very limited impact on the lives of its citizens. But the First World War is going to change this. Now, America had to be involved in the First World War. We weren't involved originally, but I mean, think about it. There were cultural ties in the United States. One half of the citizens of the United States were British and Irish descent. Those of British descent supported Great Britain. Those of Irish descent supported the Germans. 1/4 of the United States were descended from German immigrants, from Austria-Hungary. So the country was split among its citizenry. There were psychological factors. The English had a very good propaganda machine. They portrayed this as a fight for democracy against German militarism. They talked about the ruthless invasion of Belgium, the rape of Belgium. So the cause of the Allies, the British and French, was strengthened by the fact they controlled most of the means of communication with the United States. And the British had the advantage in that they spoke English and we spoke English. Then there's also an economic factor. Wilson proclaims neutrality. We're going to be neutral in deed as well as word. Well, Andrew Carnegie and a lot of people in industry thought this was a great opportunity to sell steel and to sell weaponry and to sell gunpowder and implements of war to the belligerent powers. Well, they all wanted to buy, but since the British owned the Navy, they put a blockade on Germany, and Germany could not import any raw materials or foodstuffs from the United States. But American industry thrives, and American farmers thrive by selling goods to the British and the French. And when the British and the French exhausted their capital reserves, that was no problem. J. Pierpont Morgan lent them the money to buy whatever they needed. The conflict that's going to get the United States and involved in the war was over neutral rights. Basically, international law said that as a neutral, the United States was the leading neutral, we had the right to sell and to ship to any country involved in the conflict. And that was the law. Well, we could send ships to England, France, we tried to send ships to Germany, the British would seize the ships. It would prevent the ships from going into German ports or to Austro-Hungarian ports. That was a violation of international law. Well, the British are violating international law. What are you going to do? Sue them in the Supreme Court? No, there was no court to enforce international law. So the Germans thought this was inherently unfair. The only way the Germans could strike back was by, sinking American ships. They did this through submarines. But this was considered to be an underhanded method. According to international law, if a foreign warship stopped merchantmen on the high seas, you had to surface, you had to order people off the ship, give them time to leave the ship, and